Good morning. Welcome to the August 25, 2016 Audit Committee meeting of the City of Glendale. May we please have roll?
Yes. Audit Committee member Richard Correll.
Here.
Ed Khachaturian.
Here.
Alex Parahon.
Here.
Tom O'Shaughnessy.
Here.
And Audit Committee Chair Zara Emirian will join us in a few minutes.
For purposes of this, did I call a different date?
You said August.
Oh, I'm sorry. It's the January 25th, 2016 meeting of the City of Glendale Audit Committee meeting. Because in the absence of our chair, we would look to our members to select an individual who would preside over this meeting. So we would look to the members to select an individual from among you. Is there a nomination for someone to serve as chair for purposes of this meeting only?
This is a nomination.
So there's a nomination on the part of Committee Member Parahon to select Committee Member Khachaturian to preside over this meeting.
Second.
In seeing no objection, Mr. Khachaturian will serve as the chair for the until such time as Chair Emirian arrives. So we would then go to the next item on the agenda.
Next item is number 2, business agenda report. The agenda for the Audit Committee meeting of January 25, 2016 was posted on Thursday, January 21, 2016 on the bulletin board outside of City Hall.
I would move the agenda approved as posted.
No action is necessary on that item, so we would just go on to the next item on the agenda.
Next item is number 3, oral communications, and we have no cards. Number 4 is approval of minutes. We will hold that to the end of the meeting when our chair joins us. Number 5 is action items, and we have no items. Number 6 is reports information. A, Director of Finance regarding internal audit activity report as of December 31st, 2015.
Good morning, Audit Committee members. My name is Eileen Donahue. I am the Internal Audit Manager with Internal Audit Section. I would like to provide the quarterly update for December 31st, 2015. During that quarter, we had 6 open audit projects. 3 were in the fieldwork stage and 3 were in the planning stage. One is very near completion. That's the fats, oil, and grease audit to the Department of Public Works. In addition to the 6 audit projects, we also provided our resources to the City Manager's Office to perform research and information gathering on law enforcement and fire prevention services. This will be used for educational purposes, and this work is considered non-audit, therefore an audit report will not be issued. Standard to our normally quarterly process, we conduct audit follow-up on any outstanding audit issues that have occurred based on our audit reports that we issue. During the quarter ended December 31st, 2015, we found that 12 of our audit issues had been implemented. What we standardly do is we contact the auditee where we've issued these audit reports, and we discuss with them what is the status of implementing our audit issues. 26 remain outstanding at this time. 2 are considered priority 1 risk ratings, and that's given when the report is issued. We identify priority 1s are those things that expose the city to a bit more risk. Both of these audit issues were part of the disbursement duplicate payment audit report that was issued to the Department of Finance. When we did our follow-up, we found that Department of Finance is making efforts to clear these priority 1 issues, but it's contingent on approvals and working with other departments. In the interim, Department of Finance has put in mitigating controls to lessen the severity of the risk associated with these issues. Additionally, the Audit Committee has requested that if an audit issue reaches a certain criteria, that directors or their representatives be present at an Audit Committee meeting to discuss the status of an audit issue. For the quarter ended December, We had one report, the workers' compensation audit, that was issued back in December 2013, that has 2 outstanding audit issues that they're still working through the process to clear. One related to written agreements with third-party vendors, and one related to updating certain policies and procedures. The department expects to get these cleared within the next 6 months, but again, these also are contingent on reviews and input by management of other departments. We have Matt Doyle, the Director of Human Resources, and Cheryl Scott, the representative for workers' compensation, available if you'd like to hear about the status of these audit issues. Would you like them to come up?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Good morning, members of the Commission. My name is Matt Doyle. I'm Director of Human Resources. As Ms. Donahue said, this audit, I acknowledge there are some things that still need follow-up and from the original audit. We are working closely on those things. Really, what caused the delay in these 2 items, and I believe there were probably 10 to 12 original findings and recommendations, and all of those were completed, but these 2. Between myself and others, we've spent a lot of time in the last year and a half looking at the workers' compensation operation. And that's a segment of the Department of Human Resources. And I've spent a lot of time working primarily with our public safety departments as well as our public safety unions in looking for ways to improve the process and make sure that that we are doing it in the most efficient manner and with a real focus on getting employees back to work, because where a lot of the costs are incurred in the workers' compensation field is employees being out and experiencing delays getting medical care and legal reports and things like that, which cause employees to be out for long periods of time. And it's particularly detrimental to our organization when this involves police and fire, because if someone in any other city department is going to be out for some sustained period of time, typically they're not replaced, but with police and fire, we have to hire people back in to work. In most cases, it's going to be overtime, and that really magnifies the costs. So that's one thing that we've been looking at, and I've worked with our respective employee associations for police and fire over the past year on that particular aspect of it. And one thing that we did implement this past year is something called a carve-out, where it's a special process which is called for under the workers' compensation laws, and it requires a special agreement with our employee unions to do that. And we've come to an agreement with our GPOA, that's the Police Officers Association, to establish a carve-out which would essentially speed up the process for getting our officers seen by medical authorities and speeding up the process for those reports being sent back to us as well. And that process has been in place since April of 2015, and we've seen some good results from that. The other thing that we've had done is we had a review by an outside entity, William Kelly and Associates, which occurred over the past year, and we got that report as well in, I believe it was February, March of 2015, and they had a variety of recommendations as far as things that we can be doing operationally to improve some of the things that I've already mentioned, getting employees back to work quicker, and just making our process more efficient. And the Kelly and Associates program evaluation, we've been looking at that over the past summer and working on various things. To get to the main point, the main crux of the 2 items that remain outstanding here, the one being the updating of the policy. And again, the policy from our administrative policy manual was quite dated. It had last been updated in 2003. And again, we wanted to look at the things that we had been doing both with our employee associations and the recommendations of the Kelly and Associates report. If we're going to make any substantial changes, that we would kind of hold off on updating that policy. And as it is, we are going to be doing some things differently from this point forward. Probably the biggest thing would be having some of our claims handled by third-party administration, as opposed to having it all done in-house by our own workers' compensation adjusters. So we felt it was appropriate to see how that process worked out before we finalized an update of the policy. I do have a draft of the things that we needed to update on that policy, but again, it's something that we were going to hold off on until we knew for sure how the third-party administration was going to work out.
Go ahead.
The second item had to do with two of our outside vendors performing what's called utilization review and bill review. We did not have written agreements with those, and that goes back a number of years. But what we've done and what we have right now is this third-party administration. We have an RFP that we're just about ready to release, and within that RFP, to look at the third-party administration, there will be a component where we do seek essentially bids on both the utilization review function and the bill review function. So again, we believe that this process will be handled with the current RFP process that we have going out on third-party administration. So if you have questions, I'd be happy to answer those for you.
Two quick questions. On the carve-out, is this a side letter to the MOU, or how is it being implemented within the current employment agreement with the police? And is it a change in the process or a side letter to be looked at later?
That's a great question, Commissioner Shaughnessy. It is actually a separate agreement adjacent to our MOU, which had to be done with our Employees Association, and we were able to get this through with the police department. But it's a special program that the state authorizes, but it does require a separate agreement, and that agreement was put into place approximately a year ago. It went to City Council, and for lack of a better term, it was an MOU that we had to each party had to sign and agree to.
And the second question I just have. If there's any delay because of not having third-party vendor, is it only a delay in paying the bills, but employees who happen to have a workers' comp issue are not being delayed in their medical services? Or
I'm not sure I understand your question.
Well, when you say that there's no written agreement with a third party, there are two kinds of delays from the years I worked in HR at Disney. One is that the payment to the third party is delayed, which is a bookkeeping process in a sense. The other is that because of no written agreement, the employee that needs care has their care delayed. Is the employee being given timely care, and it's just a bookkeeping issue we're dealing with, but not a human issue?
Commissioner O'Shaughnessy, it's a bookkeeping issue. There have been no delays as a result of the lack of these agreements. It's simply something that the audit section found and determined that this is not in compliance with our normal practices. But that has not been the cause of any sort of delays in
Thank you.
employees receiving care or payments.
Chair Marion, may I?
Good morning.
Good morning. To answer your question, Member O'Shaughnessy, there's also no delay in making those payments. We are making those payments. It's a preference to have written agreements, so they're basically being made on an exception basis. But with the agreements in place, we are basically in compliance with our policies and procedures.
Thank you.
Sure.
I have a question regarding the RFP process. Is the bill review and the utilization review two separate functions that are like combined into one, like the same entity can also conduct a review of the utilization and also the bill reviews? Like, could you just maybe help us understand this a little bit?
Kashidorian, yes, currently right now, those are two separate functions handled by two separate vendors, but they can be handled by one company, which is why when we are going to issue this RFP, we will have some vendors that respond and say, hey, we can do both of these functions. Some will, some will not, and we're going to evaluate all of those things. But there are some very large third-party administrators who will say, hey, we can do it all. And there are pros and cons to having somebody do it all versus having separate vendors for that. A lot of it is just making sure that you have appropriate checks and balances on certain things.
Okay, I guess my question was that second part. Could you maybe help us understand if we combine these two procedures together, what are some of the downsides? Like if one vendor provides the services?
If one vendor provides the services, you could have that vendor essentially checking their own work, and that would be really the biggest downside to that.
Is there a cost savings for the city in that standpoint for having one vendor compared to two different ones?
There could be. We just have to see what the RFP brings in. It's really hard to evaluate cost savings in this field. You can do a lot of things really on the cheap in the workers' comp field, but if that causes the poor care and poor processes and slows down certain things, you may end up with an employee being out longer than need be. Additionally, if you adopt an approach which is so harsh on the employee needing care, needing that type of service, a lot of times the employee will decide to litigate their claim, which in the long run ends up probably costing us more. One thing we do very well in this organization, at least as I've seen, is that relatively speaking, we have a fairly low rate of litigation amongst our workers' compensation claims. And our objective is, number one, make sure any injured employee gets their care in a timely fashion, and number one, that they get healthy, and then number two is that they get back to work as quickly as possible and do what we're paying them to do here. But oftentimes, if you do that poorly, or if you send them to different doctors and they're not getting the appropriate care that they need, sometimes they'll just throw their hands up and say, hey, I'm going to get a lawyer. And that process, unfortunately, often will delay it even further when you have the insertion of that element.
Now, you said it was being handled, certain functions were being handled internally as well. So does that mean those functions are going to be somehow moved aside to do other functionalities in the company, or?
It's a good question, Commissioner Parhon. What all of these audits have found, both the one conducted by internal audit as well as the Kelly and Associates audit, has found that our internal operation, as far as the caseload for all of our workers' compensation staff, is inordinately high, given the numbers of claims that we have, and the staff that we have. And I have to say, coinciding with these findings was really the recession that has affected this organization, and a lot of the cutbacks that we've seen. We have lost. Typically, we run with 3 workers' compensation adjusters, and they handle all the claims, including future medical cases, as well as those cases that are still open amongst employees who are retired. And it's a huge caseload. And what this has found is that we need to probably supplement that staff by some means, which is why we're looking at the third-party administration, and take some element of those claims and move them to a TPA. And if that works, we might choose to expand the program. But my sense is that our staff can do a much better job if they simply had a little more help and the appropriate staffing.
So kind of looking forward, is there a way to, and I'm not sure if those independent audits or reports that were done by the consultants that arrived at this conclusion, I'm not sure if this is part of the scope of work, but looking forward, is there a way to be sort of forward-thinking or preventative about the number of claims and the volume of claims that the cities that your unit undertakes? So, for example, is there a way to see any sort of trends that have emerged in the types or frequencies of claims so that maybe going forward we can sort of mitigate and prevent the claims even before they happen?
Commissioner Correll, yes, that's something that we're always doing. We have a very robust risk management program, and we look at all the claims and track them, and we have a pretty good sense of where they're coming from. Basically, the largest number of claims come from our public safety departments, and that's no knock on the public safety departments. It's just a fact of life, the kind of work they do, which requires the exertion of physical strength and body parts wear down and things like that. But we're constantly looking at those things, and that's why when we initiated the carve-out program, the first place we went to look for was our police department. And fortunately, our Police Officers Association were very much in agreement. They want to see their employees back to work as much as city management does. But there's a great deal of information that goes into those decisions.
Anybody? Anything else? Good morning, everybody.
I'm sorry, let the record reflect that Chair Marion is present. Just got to say that, sorry.
That's good. That's okay. Okay, any other comments or questions on this item? Thank you.
The final segment of our project update document lists the 5 team assignments where internal audit participates, generally in the advisory capacity for certain committees. We participated in 5 team assignments during the quarter. The one I want to highlight is the Lean Six Sigma Greenbelt program, which is a training that is being offered through the city. 10 city employees are being trained. It's approximately a 12-week course. We meet once a week, and we learn about Lean Six Sigma. And as an auditor, it's a really good learning opportunity for myself because it's where you're trying to identify where you can reduce cycle time and processes. And so it's giving me added techniques that I can share with my coworkers on when we're doing our audits and how to look for building efficiencies in the processes that we're reviewing. That concludes the project update. I'd be happy to answer any questions or take any comments.
What are some of the, looking at these other team assignments, do you have a sense of the other efficiencies or objectives of the other 3 of the 4?
They're where we participate, we sit in the meetings and we listen to them and we provide an audit perspective during the meetings, more advisory to help consider controls that are occurring. The RecTrack system, that was already implemented last spring, but they had an issue that came up with when the credit card processing was coming into play during the last quarter. There was some things that needed to be adjusted there, and so there was a meeting that was held, and our representative went to it and just provided insight there. The final one, the peer review team leader, that's where I was able to participate as a peer review member, where I went out to another audit agency and reviewed their quality control systems and made sure they were following government auditing standards, which is a great opportunity because it allows me to interact with my peers and then learn from them how they're following the auditing standards. And it just is it's a great professional growth opportunity.
And then Glendale Water and Power?
The Glendale Water and Power, the Risk Management Committee, Energy Risk Management Committee, Michelle's on that committee as well. It's where they're talking about the risk management. Do you want to add
I can
to it? 'Cause
add a
you-
little bit more to
Good
that.
at it.
That committee meets once a month, and it's made up of internal staff, members of audit, finance, legal, as well as department representatives from GWP, and we go through the various risk management functions that need to be reviewed at a committee level. It's not a Brown Act committee, it's just an internal committee, just pretty much for control purposes as well as advisory purposes within GWP for energy management.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments on this item? Okay. Let's move on to 6B.
Item 6B, Director of Finance regarding Comprehensive Annual Financial Report, CAFR, and report to the Audit Committee from Vavrinick, Trine, Day and Company, LLP.
Good morning, Chair Marion, members of the committee. My name is Michelle Flynn. I'm the Assistant Director for Finance. I'll be providing you this morning with an overview of our comprehensive annual financial report for our current fiscal year ended, or most recent fiscal year ended, June 30th of 2015. You can refer to your handouts, and the PowerPoint is also up. So what I'll cover for you today is a little bit of an intro and overview of the CAFR, and we'll talk about the timeline as well as the structure. We had also a pretty significant Government Accounting Standards Board pronouncement, GASB number 68, that we had to implement this year, so we'll touch on that. We'll talk about the results of the audit. I'll introduce Mr. David Showalter, who's the engagement partner from Vavrinick, Trine, Day and Company, and he will do his required communication to you. And we're happy to then take some questions or comments from you, but if you have something you'd like to ask along the way, please don't hesitate. VTD started their preliminary field work in June of 2015. Prior to that, there's weeks of preparation that goes on with our accounting staff in-house. We spend several weeks compiling and prepping and pulling together documents in order for VTD to come in to start their field work. They're on site in our offices for about 3 weeks, doing a variety of things, obtaining an understanding, doing their test of controls, risk assessments, etc. They came back in August for about a week where they did primarily the single audit grants testing. Confirmation letters were sent out middle or so of August, and we went through our regular June month-end close on August 20th. We continued through the process with our year-end closing procedures at the beginning of October, and then the city staff in the accounting department went through preparing the actual CAFR in first draft and second drafts. VTD came back for about 2 weeks in October where they finished up their test work, again on site, doing more detailed testing, reviewing more transactions, looking at the documentation, and getting the information that they need to get to satisfy themselves for the audit work. And then the CAFR goes through an extensive review process once we go through a first draft and second draft and all the way through. Internal staff is doing a lot of review. We have various levels of review as well as different things we're looking at. And then our accounting firm, VTD, is also doing the same thing. So they have a series of reviews, and that takes a good month or so by the time we get through that whole process. The audit opinion letter was issued on November 30th, and that is included in the CAFR. And we took the report to print at the beginning of December and were able to present it to the City Council at their December 15th meeting. The structure of the CAFR starts off with the introductory section, and in there you'll find the transmittal letter that is done by our finance director. Management staff or key professional or key officials are listed, as well as our org chart. Then the next main section is where you'll find the independent auditor's report. That's the one I just referred to that has the audit opinion in it. And right after that comes the management's discussion and analysis, which is the MD&A. And that pretty much provides an executive summary level of various financial highlights and budget highlights for the year, summary of the different statements that you see in the CAFR, summary of the bond, our debt and our bond ratings. And then working through the financial section, you'll get to the bulk of the statements, the first being the government-wide. So these are the two statements where the entire city is put into one place. And you'll see the statement of net positions, which is at Exhibit A1, and the statement of activities, which is at Exhibit A2. Those statements are broken out into governmental activities as well as business-type activities. And governmental activities are those that you would typically think of that a government would provide paid for by fees and charges or general taxes, things like police services, fire services, library, parks, community development, and then a lot of the central functions, central support functions like finance and legal, HR. And then the major business type, the business type activities are those that are supported generally through rates. So those would be like our utilities, electric, water, et cetera. Following the government-wide statements are the fund level statements, first being the governmental funds. Those start at Exhibit B1, and those are distinguished. You'll see the major governmental funds and then a summary of the non-major funds. Later in the CAFR will be a breakout and more detail of all the non-major funds. The general fund is the major, one of the major governmental funds, if not the most major. Those are that one is exhibited at Exhibit D1 and D2. Proprietary funds are the business type activity funds. Those start at Exhibit E3 and go through E1 through E3. And we have one fiduciary fund, which is the Glendale Successor Agency, which is the agency that was created after redevelopment, and that's at Exhibit F1. Following the fund level statements, you'll find the notes to the financials, which are quite extensive, and a lot of time and effort goes into putting those notes together by our accounting staff and reviewed through our staff as well as VTD, and then required supplementary information. Non-major governmental funds come next. Those are a variety of special revenue funds, which are pretty much grant-based. We have our debt service and capital projects funds in that section as well. Non-major enterprise funds, and then internal service funds. Internal service funds are central functions of the city that are housed in an internal service fund, and what we do is we basically, through a rate, charge the user departments. So, for example, we have our medical insurance fund as an internal service fund. We have fleet and equipment. We have our information services all housed as internal service funds, and then we go through developing rates to then charge all the user departments for their services. The last section is the statistical section, which is unaudited, and that has a little over 20 schedules and exhibits of historical comparison data that is very informational for readers. That's put together by the accounting staff as well as all the user departments. GASB 68, Accounting and Financial Reporting for Pensions. This was the major pronouncement that the city had to implement for this fiscal year. Prior to GASB 68, we were following recording of our pension liability under GASB 27, which did not require us to actually book the liability on the statements, but it did require us to disclose it in the CAFR notes, which we had been following. Up until this year, GASB 68 now requires us to book our net pension liability within the body of our statements. So what that did was it basically reduced significantly the city's net position. We had to book it on the government-wide statements as well as the enterprise funds. And I'll show you a quick impact of what that looks like. On the next slide, you'll see the impact on the government-wide statements. Our net position at June 30th of 2014 in our governmental activities was $950 million. Business type activities, $700 million, for a total of $1.65 billion. We had to restate that number in order to implement this GASB. So you can see that our net position took a hit in total of about $454 million. That's pretty significant. Bottom line, after all the activities for this current year, our net position is reflected in that bottom line at $642 million for governmental, $602 million for business type, and $1.24 billion for a total. Then on the major enterprise funds, primarily the electric fund took the largest hit, being the largest major enterprise fund that we have, of almost $50 million when we had to go back and restate. So we've got a reduction in their net positions as well going forward for this year. The results of the 14-15 audit, I'm happy to say that the auditors gave us a unmodified opinion in accounting language. That's what we call it, but basically what that means is that's the cleanest opinion an entity can receive. So we're very proud of that. We also received that on the single audit, which is the audit of our federal grants program. And there were no areas for recommendation, so we did not receive a management letter from the auditors this year. So I'd like to introduce Mr. David Showalter. He's the partner for Vavrnik, Trine and Day. He's our engagement partner, and he'll go through his required communications with you.
Hi, good morning, committee members. My name is David Showalter with Vavrnik, Trine Day. I did hand out just a brief presentation. I'll cover that, and that'll kind of walk us through the different reports that I'll be presenting to you this morning. So our responsibility as the independent auditor at the conclusion of the audit is to meet with the audit committee and to go over the results of the audit. And we have provided to you other reports as well. There's a letter to the audit committee that we will also cover. This presentation will cover the majority of the contents of that letter. The second slide of the handout that I gave you just covers our responsibility under generally accepted auditing standards. What our responsibility as we plan the audit is to, one, when we plan the audit, we do meet with you at the beginning of the audit. And if you recall, we did meet with you previously to go over the planning of the audit, kind of what we were going to be focusing on during the year. The risk areas were the GASB 68 implementation that Michelle presented to you. Certainly were the areas that we did need to focus on for the year. We look at internal controls with respect to the planning of our audit. That was something that we did during the interim phase of the audit, looking at the various processes and the financial systems of the city as everything consolidates into the financial statements. As a result of understanding the internal controls, that helps us to design our audit procedures. Those are the audit procedures that we're performing at the final phase of the audit, where we came back out in October, where we're doing a lot more detailed testing, transaction testing, confirmation, looking at the final draft set of financial statements and working through auditing the final balances, in addition to also auditing the compliance with respect to federal programs. And then ultimately accumulating all of that to render an opinion on the financial statements. And then in addition to that, when we review the financial statements, making sure that it conforms to generally accepted accounting principles. GASB 34, which is the current standard that provides the current format of the financial statements, making sure that everything conforms to that particular accounting standard. Michelle went through that format with you, government-wide financial statements and fund financial statements. That's all because of GASB 34 requires that format. So making sure that all the elements of the financial statements are contained in there. That includes the management's discussion analysis. We read that information to make sure that it's consistent with accounting principles, make sure that the information that's in the management's discussion analysis section of the report articulates back to the actual underlying financial statements. Management puts a lot of other information in there that talks about the fluctuations that occurred during the year compared to the prior year. So we read that to make sure that it's consistent, but we don't opine or give any opinion or any assurance over that information because it is still management's discussion. They do put some forward information in there that we don't take responsibility for. The next slide provides kind of the results of the audit for all the reports and the scope of work for the year. So the first thing that we are doing is auditing the financial statements of the city, which is the CAFR. The results of that, as Michelle alluded to, was an unmodified opinion, or it was a clean opinion. That opinion is located on page, I'll give you the page number.
1,
Page 1, okay.
the financial statement.
So page 1 of your CAFR book is where the audit opinion is located. And
Under
that's
the
probably in the
first
financial
page.
section,
Yeah.
the financial section tab, and our letterhead's on the top. So that is the audit opinion, and on the second page is where our opinion is located. At the very top, there's a header that says opinion, and it simply just reads that in all material respects, the financial statements are fairly stated, and it kind of gives a scope of what we're auditing. So basically, that paragraph basically reads that in all material respects, like I said, the financial statements are fairly stated. It's a clean opinion. We did have an emphasis of matter, which is right below that. That emphasis of matter is included in the opinion only to note the fact that there was a new accounting pronouncement issued during the year, which is accounting number 68 and 71, related to your net pension liability recording, as Michelle had already kind of worked through what that looked like on your financial statements. The next set of financial statements we have are the electric fund and the water fund. We audit those standalone reports. Same audit opinion was rendered an unmodified opinion on those reports. And then also those reports were required to also implement the GASB standard 68 and 71. The single audit was also an unmodified opinion. So that's an audit of the federal awards that the city receives during the year. Our responsibility is to audit those programs under Circular A133. We go through the process of selecting the major federal programs, and then we audit those major programs, and then render an opinion on the city's compliance. And each of those, that audit was also an unmodified or a clean opinion. And then to kind of round it out, we also do an audit of the ISIS JPA. That was also a clean opinion on that JPA audit. And then we perform some agreed upon procedures for the city. So going through our letter, our separate letter that we've issued to the council or to the audit committee, that might be in maybe your handout there. So we go through the significant audit findings, and basically this letter is laid out in accordance with our professional auditing standards of the certain things that we need to communicate to you at the conclusion of the audit. Again, we identify what we're auditing. We're auditing the financial statements. We identify the professional standards that we audit in accordance with, which is our generally accepted auditing standards, government auditing standards, also the OMB Circular A133 audit standards. So there's several sets of standards that we have to audit against in order to complete the audit for the city. Then we get into the significant audit findings. We discuss the qualitative aspects of accounting practices with respect to the financial statements and how the financial statements are prepared, the disclosures that go into those financial statements, and we comment back through this letter whether there's been any significant changes in either the accounting principles, the accounting practices or policies. We comment on estimates and sensitive disclosures. The one obvious new accounting pronouncement, GASB 68, had obviously a material effect on the financial statements that was implemented during the year. That did require a prior period adjustment to the financial statements, as Michelle walked you through previously. Significant accounting estimates that are included in the financial statements. We comment on what those estimates were, and with the result that those estimates were reasonable in relation to the financial statements taken as a whole. To give you an example, certain estimates related to the incurred but not reported claims for your workers' comp liabilities, general liabilities, there's actuarials that provide estimates for those claims. Those estimates are the basis for what's in the financial statements. And in addition, you have the CalPERS liability, your liability with respect to your pension plan. Those are actuarial reports that come from CalPERS. Those now serve as the foundation for the actual liability that's on the books now. So there's some significant liabilities that are on your financial statements that are based on actuarial assumptions, and so that is an estimate in itself. So our responsibility is to make sure that we read through those estimates, make sure that they're in conformance with GASB 68. GASB 68 has specific requirements for the actuarial and standards that they're supposed to follow, and then making sure that information is recorded properly in the financial statements. And then sensitive disclosures that are included in the financial statements. This is an item that occasionally we'll put into our letter just to highlight to the reader that there were certain disclosures that we feel are sensitive because of their nature. In this case, we have the new disclosures related to GASB 68, which is in note number 9 in the financial statements. So if you go through the report, footnote number 9, which is in the financial section, I don't know the exact page reference, but that starts the footnote for the GASB 68 presentation. And that's probably in the financial section. So essentially, that note explains the pension plan. It talks about the different types of plans that the city has. The city has 2 types of plans: a miscellaneous plan and a public safety plan with CalPERS. So there is some information that's very consistent with the prior year, talking about the types of plans that the city offers, the benefits that are provided. Where it changes from last year to this year is that last year there would be a contribution effort that would be disclosed, and then there would be 1 year's of the UAL would be presented, the unfunded liability would be presented on an actuarial basis. Going into this year, we're expanding that to now talk about the net pension liability and showing the components of the net pension liability that ties to the face of the financial statements, and talking about how that net pension liability was actually derived, going through the actuarial assumptions. So there's a lot more detail that goes into the footnote that is now included. And in addition, there's a sensitivity analysis that's included in the footnote that the GASB standard requires to show if the net pension liability, if the discount rate that was used to derive the net pension liability went up or down 1%, this is what the net pension liability would look like. And that difference is material to the financial statements. So that in itself was an item that we wanted to also alert you to that. And the CalPERS did approve reducing the discount rate, or in the process of approving it, down to 6.5% over a potential 20-year period. So that's a kind of a real scenario here where that sensitivity analysis really does come into play to help at least understand potentially what that liability would look like. It's also important to note that the liability is measured as of June 30, 2014. So with CalPERS, there's always going to be a 1-year lag between when the measurement date or when the liability was actually measured by the actuary. There's always going to be a 1-year lag just because CalPERS has to get the reports out to all the 3,000 jurisdictions in California ahead of time. So there's always going to be kind of this 1-year lag time. So the measurement date is as of 2014. Going into the 2016 audit, your financial statements will reflect the measurement date as of 2015. So you're always going to have this 1-year lag behind your fiscal year. So just something for you to know.
And for the audit committee, that's pages 74 through 81, if you want to take a look at that.
Thank you. Okay. Going through the rest of the letter. On page 5 of the presentation, we had no disagreements with or difficulties with management. As far as we know, management did not consult with any other accountants on accounting matters during the past year. We have no other audit findings or issues that we need to bring to your attention. Management signed a representation letter dated November 30th, 2015. And as far as significant deficiencies in internal control or compliance, we don't have a letter to provide to you that we did not identify any material weaknesses. With respect to status of prior year findings, there were 2 findings that were related to the single audit from last year's audit. Those 2 findings have been implemented and cleared for this year, so they are included in the single audit report. The very last page of the single audit report will show the status of the prior year findings, and it will show that those 2 items have been implemented. And then looking to the future, we do have several new accounting pronouncements that are going to be effective in the next few years. Starting with next year, 2016, there is a new standard, number 72, that's going to basically provide more guidance on fair value measurement for investments. and there will be some additional disclosures that will go into the financial statements. So more disclosure will go into the report that will talk about the characteristics of your investments and how you fair value those investments, and will require you to provide certain level categories for those investments on how you obtain fair value. So certain investments that you have, the fair value can be readily determinable by maybe opening up the Wall Street Journal and determining, okay, there's my investment, I can see what its fair value is. Other investments, you don't have that ability because they're not traded on a daily basis. So there's different types of fair value and methods on getting fair value, and depending on that method and how readily available that information is, you'll categorize those in your financial statements. And then looking forward, we have a new standard that deals with the OPEB liability. So just what we did for the net pension liability, we're going to do the same thing for the OPEB liability. So right now, your OPEB liability is only reflected on your financial statements and is reflective of the difference between what you were actuarially required to contribute versus what you actually contributed, and that's reflected on your financial statements as a liability or an asset, depending on where you. Right now, I think it's a liability for the city. So basically, you'll go through the same steps that we did for GASB 68, is where you'll have to determine what that actuarial accrued liability is for the plan as a whole, which is currently only a footnote disclosure. That will now come onto the financial statements, and that'll be first implemented in fiscal year 2017 for the city. So it's a few years out, and depending on the city's pension plan or OPEB plan at the time, an actuary will have to come in and provide an actuary of the liability, and then go through the same steps that we did for GASB 68 to bring that liability onto the financial statements. So that's kind of the more significant standard that's going to be out there in the next few years, kind of like a more of a round two, let's say, for GASB 68, but it's going to be for your other post-employment benefit plans instead. So that pretty much covers the presentation. Do you have any questions or comments?
Gentlemen, questions, comments?
I guess I have one question. In this letter that was attached to our handout, there's a statement here that says we are engaged to report on the combining an individual fund statements and schedules which accompany the financial statements but are not RSI.
Okay.
When you're combining these statements and schedules, and there's some information that are provided to you, and you just mentioned that you're not responsible for the contents, you just basically take that information and apply it. Is that the reason why you went and checked to see whether or not the numbers did not change from the year prior, and that's the extent of review that you conduct with respect to?
Yeah, I'll go through that section of the letter for you.
Okay.
I apologize, I didn't go through that with you. So the other matters section of the letter. So we comment in our letter on what our responsibility is for the other information that's included in the financial statements. So if you look at the CAFR document, it is a very lengthy document. There's a lot of tables and schedules in there. And so in order to kind of carve out what we're opining on and then what other information we are taking responsibility on, we list that here in this letter. So the first section of the other matters basically covers what we refer to as required supplementary information. So this is what the accounting standards say needs to be included with the report, but us as the auditor are not required to opine on the information. So things like the management's discussion and analysis, and there's some other schedules that are included that relate to your pension plan. There's some schedules related to the pension plan and your OPEB plan. We don't opine on that information, so we just call that out, that we read through it, we make sure that it conforms to the accounting principles, but we're not giving any assurance over it. Okay, so that's the first item. The second item is that we were engaged to report on the combining an individual fund statements and schedules. So in the CAFR document, toward the kind of the back of the report, there's a section that's for what we refer to as your non-major fund section, where all of your individual funds are included that don't meet the criteria to be referred to as a major fund. So what our responsibility is under our auditing standards is to make sure that information is fairly stated in all material respects in relation to the financial statements taken as a whole. So we make sure that it ties to the underlying support. We do apply materiality to that information, and if it does exceed a certain materiality, we are auditing, certain balances and transactions on those individual schedules. But just so you know, we're not giving you a separate opinion on each of those individual smaller funds. Okay. And then the statistical section, which is at the back of the CAFR, that gives you that 10-year history of the city. In addition, there's some information at the front of the report that talks. There's a transmittal letter. There's other information that's at the beginning of the report. We don't opine on that information, although we do read it to make sure that it is consistent with accounting principles. Again, it's similar to like RSI, where we don't provide any assurance over that information. Yeah. So the letter does outline what our responsibility is for that information. So.
Thank you.
Okay.
I have a question. Why is the single audit report sort of a separate document from the CAFR?
Yeah, I think that's just that's a preference for the city. The documents kind of go to different places. The single audit report will be provided to a federal audit clearinghouse, which is at the federal level. So both documents actually do go to the federal clearinghouse. But I think from a report distribution, the CAFR potentially is going to be going to other disseminating agents, such as your continuing disclosure. The single audit is not required to go to your bond continuing disclosure, so it's kind of best just to kind of keep those separated. But I think the city does provide both reports on its website, so they are together. When the reports have to go to the state for oversight reporting, to the state controller's reports, both reports do go together, but they're just not contained together. And in the CAFR document, which is the city's financial statements, we refer to as a CAFR, or a comprehensive annual financial report. Essentially, those are all the elements that make up the comprehensive annual financial report. And the city does submit a report to the GFOA every year for its award consideration, and those are the elements that the GFOA prescribes that are to be provided to the GFOA for award consideration. The single audit document is somewhat of an additional audit that doesn't need to be included in that report, just because it's not, from the context, it's not necessarily they're not necessarily connected in that way. The single audit report, if you read through it, does refer back to the financial statements, does refer back to the fact that we did audit the financial statements and rendered opinion, and the date that we issued our opinion. So there is some connectivity there, but they're not required to be presented together. So it's more of a preference.
And then one other question. In your report here, you stated some future sort of accounting procedures that are coming down the pipeline in relationship to GASB.
Yeah, so as I was referring to previously, we had GASB 72, which is going to be effective next year, that's going to deal with your fair value measurement. And then in future years, we have the additional pronouncements. Pronouncement number 74 and 75 are going to be primarily related to the pension plan, or to your OPEB plan. And then 73 is more of a kind of an omnibus to the GASB 68, which basically, if you had a pension plan that was not accounted for in a trust fund, then GASB 73 would cover that type of a plan. So 73 is like is 68, but it's for those non-trust type plans.
So then my question is, I'm assuming then next year when we meet again, in the presentation that was given by staff, particularly around the net position, how it was impacted by GASB in some ways this year, particularly there was a decrease, right, in the net position over last year. So I'm assuming going forward, as a kind of looking in the crystal ball, so to speak, I'm assuming it'll reduce even further because we're integrating these items, I guess, in a more robust and thorough way, and therefore it would also reflect in a decrease in net position a year from now. I'm just trying to set the expectation.
How these will impact the financial statements for next year for GASB 72, This is going to affect the fair value measurement of your investments primarily. So if there was current standards required a certain way to fair value your investments, and we adopt the new standard, and that new standard required a different method that potentially would lower those values of those investments, then potentially there could be a restatement of the financial statements in order to conform to the new accounting pronouncement. It's undetermined at this point whether there'll be any effects at all. Most of the city's investments are highly liquid, so they're all somewhat current. There are some longer investments like bonds and things like that, but I don't suspect that there's going to be a significant effect like you just saw with the GASB 68. The GASB 75 standard for your OPEB liability potentially could have a similar effect like you just saw with, not to that extent, but certainly would have an impairment on your net position. But that'll be for another few years out.
Okay.
Yeah, so all these standards do require that you go back to the beginning of the year and adjust at the beginning of the year and then kind of move forward. And in some cases, there's a decrease. In some cases, there could be an increase. So depending on the applicability of the standard. So, yeah.
You know what? I wanted to follow up on that. So I'm trying to understand the discount rate, the assumed discount rate of 7.5% versus what you've listed. I mean, for example, page 78, if you could walk me through, it appears that the real returns that are being calculated are lower than the discount rate that's being assumed significantly. And so, on page 78, you've given us that list, and then on page 80, there's the sensitivity of the net pension liability to changes in the discount rate.
Okay.
So help us understand how, because you just mentioned in response to that question that your assumption is that there probably won't be much of a change, but it appears that the discount rate that's being used for the pension liability is higher than what the actual return is. Okay. Or, I'm sorry, lower, would it be?
Okay, I'll walk you through that.
Yeah, help me understand.
So the schedule on page 78, which is simply, what this is that the CalPERS is they're the record keeper for your pension plan, and they're also the investment house for your pension plan. So they manage both sides. They manage the investments, and they manage the retiree benefits and so forth. So everything that you see here related to the asset class and the allocation of those assets and those real rates of return are all coming directly from CalPERS. So the city doesn't really have any control over any of this information. So CalPERS sets a target on what they want a rate of, what their real rate of return is going to be for their plan investments, just like the city would for their own investments. What the reality is and what the objective is are two different things. So CalPERS is trying to achieve a 7.5% over a long term. This is a long-term discount rate, trying to maintain a 7.5% discount rate over a long period of time. Obviously, there's going to be peaks and valleys along the way. So what CalPERS has decided to do is to look to change that 7.5% down to a 6.5% rate. So that's something that's going to be, they're discussing to spread that over a 20-year, basically smooth that out over 20 years, not take the hit all at once, but smooth it out over 20 years. The page on page 80, if they were to take that hit today, you can kind of get an idea how that would impact your liability. By going down 1%, your liability would go from $394 to $619. So that's a pretty significant effect. But they're not going to do that over a one-year period. They're proposing to do that over a longer period of time. So just to clarify, the information that was on page 78 is provided directly from CalPERS. What our responsibility is to make sure that it at least coincides with what CalPERS is reporting. This information is also audited by CalPERS' auditor, from which the city receives those audit reports, upon which they take that information, they put that into the financial statements. We want to make sure as auditors that This information, the disclosures, and everything that's included in the city's financial statements conforms with GASB 68 disclosure requirements, and that the information does tie back to what CalPERS is reporting on their side. And then on page 79, which was the next page after the asset class discussion, talks about the changes in net pension liability. And this really gives you more perspective of each plan, starting with miscellaneous, and then the next one is the public safety. The net pension liability is the column on the far right. And so the sum of each one of those plans is the 394, but you can see that the net pension liability is a function of two things: the liability, which is the total liability, and the plan's assets. And so you can get a picture of what the assets are in the plan for each of those plans and what the total liability is. You can see the total liability is around $1.7 billion. That's the total liability for your pension plan, for all your members, for all your employees, going out, projecting out all the way to the end of their service life, and then discounting that back to the current period. Offsetting that is what your available assets are as of June 30th, 2014 with CalPERS. And you can see that there's definitely a shortfall there, so that's why you have the net pension liability. So the volatility of this number is such that the market plays a big role on how that number changes. And if you look to the assets at the beginning of the year, you had $688 million in the miscellaneous plan, you had $452 million in the safety plan, and as you move all the way down that column, you can see that the investment income just between 13 and 14 was $117 million. That was a significant increase that really the city didn't have to contribute to. It was earned just based on market. That's not going to be the same going into future years. That's how it's the volatility of that. So that number is very volatile to the market. The total pension liability is volatile to changes in the demographics of the city's employment staff. So whether you provide raises or you change the benefit plans will affect that pension liability over time. So
yeah, and thank you so much for clearing that up. So that question might be something that we might have to ask Michelle and city staff in terms of what the expectation of a potentially lower discount rate is going to do for the city's internally perceived health of their finances. As that pension liability continues to be booked as a greater and greater liability, how that's going to affect other things within the city. So maybe we'll circle back to that. Thank you.
All right.
And also to add to that as a note to staff, and I don't see it here, but maybe it's presented elsewhere. What are the city's plans and intentions around new hires in the next year or beyond? That would also kind of help inform this conversation as well.
I'd be happy to address those if you'd like. With regards to the rates that we pay CalPERS, whether they're discounting it at 7.5 or they move forward to the 6.5, like as David mentioned, they'll be smoothing that over a long-term period. So we will be able to we continually update our 7-year forecast going into every budget season and look at what those rates are, keeping a very conservative approach of not spending everything that we think we're going to get. At this point, we don't have any definite numbers out for a couple of years from CalPERS. Once those rates come, yes, there will be some budgetary impacts that we'll have to look at fixing in order to be able to afford to do that. With regards to hiring staff, and currently we're at our head count for full-time equivalents is about 1,568, I believe, somewhere around there. We are pretty lean as we had cut several hundred positions over the last few years because of the various retirement incentives that we've offered and separation incentives. We are looking at keeping that number fairly constant and possibly hiring back a very small number in the areas that need some attention. So we've already started the budget process for this year, going into this year, this coming year. That's what we're looking at. So that you won't see the full-time numbers go up much, at least in the short term, from my guess. And like I said, we're continually updating our forecast to look at the CalPERS rates. We're kind of, I don't want to say we're at their mercy, but we definitely have to make the adjustments as they change their rates. Yes.
Thank you. And I mean, we're still looking at, I mean, even smoothed out to over 20 years, you're still looking at somewhere in the vicinity of $10 to $12 million of impact per year if the discount rate changes?
I don't even know what the number would actually be. We'll have to look at it and see.
Okay.
But unfortunately, Bob's not here. He's the one that has those numbers off the top of his head. But Sujan, do you know what a 1%? No. We'll get back to you on that one.
Okay. Great. Let's continue.
Okay. So I've concluded my presentation. If you have any other questions.
I just have one, I guess, a follow-up question. So from what I understand, your audit is mostly procedural, so you just basically look at the data and saying, well, according to the acceptable standards, this meet the standards, but at any point do you raise, I don't know, red flags or, issue warnings in terms of where the statements are heading, like in terms of, okay, the next 5 years and the next 2 years, these are some of the areas that need to be addressed in terms of not the procedure or the standards, but like what the numbers show. Like, do you engage in any sort of financial analysis of the data? And that's sort of a question that I had.
So, I mean, part of our audit is at the beginning of the audit, we're doing a risk assessment over the audit itself. We're also, doing a risk assessment over the financial statements to see if there are any issues that we need to be concerned about with respect to planning our audit, making sure we have sufficient audit evidence to support the balances that are in the financial statements. From a financial condition perspective, what our auditing standards require that we do, and what also requires management to do from an accounting presentation perspective, is to look out 1 year from the balance sheet date. So management has a responsibility to look out 12 months after the balance sheet date to determine whether there's any issues. I guess, the term that we use in the auditing standards is called going concern. So we look out to see, is there even a risk that the city has a going concern risk? We don't feel that there is a going concern risk for the city, so we don't classify that as a high risk concern for our audit. But if it was something that we felt that there was a financial consideration there that we needed to look at, then we would have to look out, at least 1 year beyond the balance sheet date. That's what our professional auditing standards require. So in that type of scenario, if that was the case, it's not the case here at the city, but if it was the case, and other agencies that we do audit that have those situations, management is required to provide a plan on how they're going to address their financial condition. Again, it only has to go out 1 year from the balance sheet date. So in a lot of cases when we're auditing, maybe 4, 5, 6 months after the balance sheet date. So there's 6 months to look into the future. So we really rely on management to come up with a plan that seems like it complies with the auditing standards, complies with the accounting standards, seems like a plan that's going to ensure that the entity is going to survive into the next fiscal year. There's a lot of things that we look at to make sure that, it's pretty rare. In fact, I don't think I've seen a government really fail. We've seen other cities go bankrupt, but they're still in business, they're still in operation, they're still doing things. So a going concern for a governmental entity is a little bit different than a commercial enterprise because there isn't tax revenue coming in that will stop. It'll continue to, tax revenues will continue to come in. The cities have a lot of latitude to ensure things move forward. But as part of our audit, we do look out to see, okay, what are some of those new pronouncements that are going to come out, and how is that going to affect the financial statement? Certainly for this particular pronouncement, GASB 68, we knew that it was going to have an effect on the financial statements. It did have an effect on the net position of the city, and it reduced its net position. Certainly that is something for the reader to understand. understand why that net position was impaired, because it was an accounting pronouncement that was required to be implemented, and it's not necessarily as a result of the economic conditions of the city itself. So there is an explanation, and the footnote disclosures provide a good explanation as to why that net position did decrease. Certainly, we understand why as your independent auditor, so that we can provide an opinion on the fair presentation of your financial statements. If there were concerns that we felt that management was not necessarily wanting to engage in correcting, we have a responsibility to bring that to the attention of not only the audit committee, but also include that information into our report as well. So there is a reporting mechanism for that as well. So
Showalter, quick question. During the course of the audit, was there some delays that were caused due to certain departments' data not being available timely to you guys, or was there something else that caused delays that was more internally with your group?
I mean, as far as the audit goes, this year's audit went pretty smoothly, considering the fact that there was a new accounting pronouncement that had to be implemented. Certainly, the accounting staff did a really great job of. One, we started going through GASB 68 probably about a year ago, working through that process. Management was already going through the process of determining what the impact was going to be of implementing the new standard, all the way even before the budget was implemented. They were working through that process. That made it really easy for us when we came in to work through the new accounting entries that needed to go into the financial statements, go through the disclosures. We had additional testing that we needed to do on our side as far as testing the census information that the city provides to CalPERS on a pay period by pay period basis. We had to test that information to make sure that that information that was provided to CalPERS actually ties back to the underlying support. So there was some additional testing that we needed to do on our side, but overall, I mean, there was really no significant delays in the audit, and I think that going back to the city, having really professional staff really understand what they're doing, really makes our audit a very smooth audit. So we really appreciate their effort.
Sounds good. Looks like Eileen, Donahue, and Michelle, and everyone else in the departments out there did a great job then to make their job a lot easy.
I have just one quick question for you, and it may not be pertinent right now, but let's see. Page 90, you discuss under note 16, successor agency, that the city is in active litigation with the Department of Finance on a denial on a city loan and transferring funds because of the end of redevelopment agencies. Page 94, you discuss subsequent events of Senate Bill 107 and that there's a postponement of 2 years for the countywide oversight board. Do you have any place in this report that addresses the optional changes in funding given whether this litigation goes in favor of the City of Glendale or State Department of Finance, or is that not yet relevant? And do we know what the impact is on the delay of 2 years for the countywide oversight boards? And again, this may be a question we need to look into, but
I'm going to say that's a question that management should probably tackle, since it's their footnote, their disclosures.
Okay.
There's a lot of issues going on with the RDA right now. So the disclosures we have in here are all contingency-based types of disclosures. So I don't know the current status on some of those items, so I wouldn't be able to really comment on where we are with those. I think management would be able to better field that question.
One of the things that caught my eye is we did a very rapid scan of a impressive bit of homework here.
I can certainly address your questions. With regards to the loans with the Department of Finance, we have that in our forecast, in our budget forecast, our 7-year forecast, if we do not get that and if we get it. So we have best case and worst case scenario. However, late last week, we got a tentative ruling for approval of those loans. So we're still waiting. There's still an appeal process that could happen, but it is looking better for us. So I think that will continue. We'll continue to keep it conservative in our forecast. We have it there, like I said, with and without. And I'm sorry, I missed your second question with regards to what?
On Senate Bill 107, they said that the county-wide oversight boards, near bottom on page 94, will not begin until July 2018, a postponement of 2 years. Is this delay in the county-wide oversight boards under Senate Bill 107 have any foreseeable impact on the city of Glendale? Or do we know yet?
I honestly am not sure, but I can find out for you.
I can comment on that one. So when they enacted the dissolution law a few years ago, there was a plan to consolidate all the successor agencies into one agency at each county. They're delaying that implementation to have one, what they refer to as kind of a super successor agency, let's say, that would kind of administer all of the RDA dissolution activities for each agency within the county. That was supposed to start in 2018, and they're postponing that a few more years out. So that's what that's related to.
It's supposed to start this year, and they're postponing it a couple more years.
Yes, you're very correct. Exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Chair Marion?
Yes.
I failed to acknowledge my staff with regards to the preparation and all their hard work on the CAFR. I had it in my notes, and I sailed right past it. So in the audience is Sujin Lee. She's our stellar accounting manager. Her right and left arms are two accounting supervisors, Alan De Leon and Teresa Clark. The three of them led an incredible team of half new accountants this year and some seasoned accountants, and they did a great job in pulling all this together. Thousands of hours of work, like I mentioned. They start well before David's team comes out in June. I think they've probably already almost started for this next year. I know there's a folder set up out there on our shared drive, and they just put in a tremendous effort. So I'd like to thank them. Apologize for not mentioning you guys sooner. So thank you.
And I also have Michael Shu, who's our audit manager. So he pretty much leads the audit day to day, and certainly he had a lot to do with making sure that we got the audit done timely and that we were able to issue in November and get to that council meeting there on the 15th. So I also want to commend Michael, too. So.
Very good. Are there any other questions or comments?
In terms of the public having access to this information, I did receive the links before today's meeting and did a cursory overview of the PDF of the document. But in terms of something very simple, like bullet points, even 1 or 2 slides, for the public, I don't think I saw that. I may have missed it. But is there something like that for the reason I'm saying this is because there's a lot of really good information here, and the majority of the public, I think, would find it overwhelming. So, and there's a lot of good news, which is obviously the part that we want to get out, right?
You're referring to the CAFR itself?
Yeah.
We do another publication. It's called the Popular Annual Financial Report, and that's in its final draft right now. And that's it's a little bit more than a couple bullet points, but it's a lot easier of a document to read than this for the average person, and it does have a lot of what you're mentioning, and that will be available on the website once that's ready.
Okay, great.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any kind of a motion required in appreciation of the splendid work that's been done, both because it's a recognition from the audit committee and also somewhere down the line, if the HR is looking at any one of the people in the room about raises, that's a gold star to put in their personnel file?
I don't know if that's appropriate. I mean,
I just thought I'd ask.
Okay. Okay, well, if we don't have anything else on 6B, did we table any items in terms of the approval of minutes?
Yes, we tabled both.
We did, and we'd like to perhaps take them one at a time because there will be different voting requirements. And also for the record, moving forward, the minutes will only reflect the general activity of the committee because the meetings are now televised, and the videotape would be a more accurate reflection of what's occurred at each of the meetings. So moving forward, you will see a more condensed reporting of the minutes. So we'll ask Mary to read each item into the record separately.
Very good. So 4A, please.
4A is minutes of the Audit Committee meeting held on Thursday, August 27th, 2015.
Do I have a motion regarding this particular item?
I'll make a motion to approve.
I'll second it.
Motion and a second. Roll call.
Audit Committee member Richard Corral was not present at the meeting. Ed Kachadurian,
Yes.
Alex Parajon,
Yes.
Tom O'Shaughnessy is a new member, was not present, and Audit Committee Chair Zari Amirian.
Yes. Item 4B, please.
Minutes of the Audit Committee meeting held on Monday, October 26, 2015.
Okay. Do I have a motion on this item?
So moved.
Any seconds? Roll call, please.
Audit Committee member Richard Corral, again, is a new member, was not present. Ed Kachadurian,
Yes.
Alex Parajon,
I abstain. I wasn't present.
Tom O'Shaughnessy,
Yes.
and Audit Committee Chair Zari Amirian.
Yes. And I'd just like to clarify that motion was to approve those minutes as submitted. Correct?
Yes.
Okay. Action item number 7, please.
Number 7 is Audit Committee or staff comments.
Please.
Although we didn't take action on the, commendation that you were proposing, I'm assuming at this time we could verbally express our appreciation. And as a new member of this body, it's very impressive, not only in terms of putting together the report and your ability to manage the process, which is impressive, but also successfully working with the consultant in a timely fashion in a way it clearly probably works with other cities and has something to compare it to. So, it's very impressive, and congratulations on that. So.
Yeah, thank you to staff and to Vavrnik Trinan Day for providing us with these reports, and I'm also looking forward to working with the Audit Committee now that we have a full complement of the Audit Committee. I'm looking forward to working with each of you in the coming year. And I'm looking forward to our meetings continuing to be productive. Any other comments from the Audit Committee? Yes.
I'm always impressed with the answers to the questions. And so far in my 2 meetings, the questions have been responded to clearly, succinctly, page number, or if it's something that needs to be further investigated, I'm quite confident that the answers will be in very quick response to our questions. Coming from Disney and then politics, the way people don't answer questions concerns me. I have had no concerns sitting on the Audit Committee because no one has not answered a question. They have answered it clearly, or they've said, we'll get back to you, and I know they will because it's a little bit more detailed. So I'm just pleased with the interaction with staff, and I'm looking forward to the next year as well.
To that end, remind me again, what is the process in terms of follow-up? And we did ask a few questions that required follow-up, and I don't recall how exactly the next steps in terms of that follow-up and how that plays out.
I can reply to that. Depending on the nature of the question, some questions require follow-up documentation, which if one committee member requests it, then all committee members will receive the records. If the question warrants placement of the item on a future agenda, then working with the chair, we will determine which agenda to place it on, and it'll come back in that fashion.
Thank you.
Okay, if there are no further audit committee comments, staff comments? Seeing none, let's move on to item 8.
Item 8 is new business.
We have any new business? No. Item 9,
Adjournment.
motion?
I move.
So adjourn.